I got one yes. Let's try again. Are we ready?
Yes!
Hi, everyone. We've all been on Zoom webinars, so we've forgotten that you don't have a mute button. Oh, you need that, don't you? Is that messing up for your recording? Are you okay? Okay. Hi, everyone. Ooh. Hi, I'm Meredith Schweitzer. This is so bizarre, because who has been to an in-person lecture post-COVID so far? A couple? Oh, you brave souls. You're so much braver than me. Okay, so this is the first time I've been talking in front of people for over 2 years because of COVID. It's so crazy. So I'm so happy to be back in front of everyone and with our people. Okay, again, I'm Meredith Schweitzer. I'm the former curator at the New Mexico History Museum in Palace of the Governors. I left there, I want to say a little over 5 years ago, but was really involved in the Fred Harvey exhibit that I believe is still there, was recently. So let's talk about what we're doing today. Welcome to this afternoon's program. I'm so grateful to Fonda and the whole team at Fonda, everyone from Ed to Britta to everyone else for making this afternoon happen. It's an amazing place. The team here is really wonderful, so if you see any of the support staff from Fonda, I really hope that you say thank you to them for all that they do to make things happen here. So what are we doing today? Today we're talking about women and the history of Fred Harvey and the history of Fonda and Route 66. We have 3 amazing speakers, so I'm going to try to be brief, which is hard for me. So I'm going to channel being brief. And what we're going to do is I'm going to just sort of set the stage a little bit. And then I'm going to hand it over. We have 3 speakers. They'll each talk for about 10 or 15 minutes, give or take. I think we have some shorter and some longer. And then I have a few questions for the panelists. We'll do a little bit of like a roundtable kind of conversation. And then we'll open it up for a few questions from you all. So as you're going, if you have something you think of, please hold on to it. There's a microphone here, so we'll be able to actually have a discussion. So what I wanted to do in the introduction is sort of frame the fact that what I love about the history of Fred Harvey in particular is that there's something for everyone. If you love jewelry, there's something. If you love architecture, if you love women's history, if you love railroad history, there's literally something for everyone. So I joke with Stephen Fried, who wrote Appetite for America, the best book there is right now out there on the general history of Fred Harvey. What I like to joke about with him is, when I started at the History Museum, I was like, okay, maybe we'll do like these Fred Harvey weekend things that we had been doing 1 or 2 more times. And they're on their 14th year, 15th, 16th, 57th, I don't know, year of doing these Fred Harvey weekends, because Fred Harvey won't die. And we are happy about that. So the history is really there's something for everyone, and it's always evolving, and I'm just so grateful that my career has touched some part of that history. And that sort of is the next point here, that I want to suggest today that Fonda, the part of Fonda that we're going to get into today, because the land that we're on now, there was some form of an inn from the 1600s on. So the history that we're going to get into today is really from 1922 on. So Fred Harvey, the history of Fonda and Fred Harvey is really Fonda comes in a little late in the race of the Fred Harvey history. But what I want to argue is that actually there's no end to this race, that the baton keeps being handed to the next generation. And I think that what Jenny is going to get into really illustrates how the generations continue and evolve, and the value that there is in being able to embrace the history and move forward into a contemporary way. So there's no end to this race, right? And I think that there are new ways to look at how culture and society and history, are impacted by particular legs of the race, and where women in particular, are as baton holders or otherwise. But maybe even more interesting than the fact that we look back over the racers over time, right, is that we can see like new details about like the track that particular baton holder, whether it was a man or a woman, we're going to talk more about the women baton holders today, that we can learn more about the track they were on. We can learn more about, who that woman was racing against, or maybe uncover details about who was in the stands, cheering them on, or who was hoping that woman would fail. That I think that there's the wonderful thing about Fred Harvey and the Fonda history in particular here is that there's always an opportunity for you to see more of the nuance of the, of the race. And the other thing I want to mention is that, what is the other thing I want to mention? So there's some, what's that?
You're really young for that.
Are you? Don't heckle me. I think the thing that the way that I want to kind of set this stage, right, is that there's something really interesting about the wide spaces in New Mexico and the parallel of those wide open spaces with these really intimate networks of friendships and artist communities and influencers that makes New Mexico's history unique, at least in my mind. And that really starting in the, you can go back to, prehistory, to colonial history, to women on the Santa Fe Trail, to women who witnessed New Mexico become a state in 1912. And there's something really interesting at all of those stages, right, that's tied to women's history. But there is this moment in the Southwest, in New Mexico and Arizona, kind of more specifically, where there's just this like tidal wave of mostly wealthy, Anglo intellectual women who come out to the Southwest and really start to like make a name for themselves. So those will sound super familiar, it's like Alice Corbin, it's Mary Cabot Wheelwright, it's Amelia Elizabeth and Martha White, who they came in 1922. So you could even throw Mabel Dodge Lujan in there, who in a lot of ways I think of Mabel Dodge Lujan as like rejecting Santa Fe because there were too many white women. She's like, I'm gonna get out of here. And that's in the late teens, early 20s too. So there's this kind of wave of women that make the sort of birth of what we think of now as La Fonda. It's like this crucible that La Fonda like comes out of, is coming out of this really interesting, women-driven, intellectual and artistic history. So I just want you to like keep that in mind as we start to think about the early days of La Fonda, the 20s and that era, because I think it really does in some ways help us sort of think about the role of arts and culture in how we think about history. It's not just dates on a timeline, it's relationships, and often those relationships are driven by women who have a perspective and who have something that they want to accomplish in the world, and that we're lucky enough that there were enough of those women in the Southwest that we can celebrate that history. Okay, before I hand it over to the presenters, I also want to just sort of frame that what we're talking about today is, like I said, this trajectory. So if you have questions that have to do with any part of that sort of those tipping points, because I'm not giving you a lot of dates on a timeline, bring those up and we can fill them in, because I think it's, let's actually do this. How many of you have been to a Fred Harvey related event in the past? See, you don't need a timeline. Give me a break. Okay. I was like, Jenny, I'm going to do a whole timeline at the beginning with a graphic, and then I did not do it. Okay. So let me hand it over to the presenters. Again, I'll sort of watch the clock, but I'm not going to be too exacting about it, because I think I'd rather listen to these women, for an hour than 15 minutes each. I think probably each of these conversations could be, a full-blown conversation, or a full-blown presentation. So I want to give them the time and space to be able to give you all some value. But let me do some introductions, and you may not even need them, quite frankly, because I think everyone will be familiar if you've come to some other Fred Harvey related events. Barbara Felix, closest to me, is an award-winning architect. She's the founder of Barbara Felix Architecture and Design, and I think she's one of the most creative professionals that I've ever had the opportunity to know. I think we've known each other for several years, and have worked on some of the Fred Harvey history work, but I also had an opportunity to work on a project that didn't really come to fruition at the History Museum. But what I love about Barbara and her approach is, and that I think is particularly unique, is that she has this ability to embrace a dedication to honoring history while also employing really contemporary practices. So she's interested in sustainability and in being a good architect for the project and for the planet, I would say, that sounds so grandiose, but it's true. So her projects include the Acoma Sky Cultural Center and the Hacienda at Hotel Santa Fe, and of course, which she's going to get into today, is the work that she did here at Fonda on the Plaza. So that's Barbara. Katrina, who's on Zoom from Spain, looking beautiful. We see you, Katrina. That's something you would never say about a man presenter, looking beautiful. How rude of me. Looking professional and accomplished. Katrina Parks has a BFA from the University of New Mexico in painting and drawing and an MFA from San Francisco State University in film production. She's the writer and director and executive producer of the Harvey Girls, Opportunity Bound. How many of you have seen the full documentary? Katrina, about half the room has their hands up, so you have some newbies that we can indoctrinate. It's a historical documentary that is so well done, that tells the stories of often young women who worked in Harvey houses as waitresses, and we have two who we love, who are near and dear to us, who are here. Raise your hands, Burnett and Beverly. My neighbor. The film was nominated for a James Beard Foundation Award and is really a wonderful storytelling project. And she's also worked on, or has created now, Route 66, the untold story of women on the Mother Road, which I believe is being broadcast nationally now. Is that true, Katrina? Nod if that's true. Good. As she explained for that film, it takes viewers through the extraordinary lives and achievements of women who overcame gender discrimination and segregation to build fulfilling lives for themselves and generations to come on America's most iconic highway. From entrepreneurs to waitresses, from anthropologists to politicians, from artists to military sergeants, these women transformed their communities and the American West for better through their hard work, perseverance, and ingenuity. Isn't that a nice summary? And lastly, so she's going to get into some of that work today as well. And lastly, Jenny Kimball, who Jenny, I went back to your a full-on bio. I don't know if you care that people talk about your undergrad degree, but she does have an undergrad degree, and it's in law. From the Southwestern Methodist University in Dallas. She's licensed in both Texas and New Mexico and moved from Dallas to Santa Fe in 1989. And I think you're going to get into your role as part of the ownership of La Fonda, obviously. But I saw somewhere that Ethel and Sam Ballin, who Ethel you were going to talk about today, who was the owner, they were the owners of La Fonda after the Harvey Company sold the hotel in 1968. I think they had an influence on you moving here. Is that true? Okay. So I'm interested to hear that history. And that's one of the things, even having done this for years being part of the community that's learning about the Harvey history and LaFonda's history, I learn something new every single time I get together with everybody. So this is exciting for me as much as it is for you. Hopefully, it's exciting for you. In 2000, she accepted the position of the president of ECMC Foundation, a national nonprofit involved in educational issues throughout the U.S. She was one of LaFonda's attorneys since 1989 and has served as the chairman of the board of LaFonda since 2007. And in 2014, she and her brother, along with a few select investors, purchased the hotel. So in addition to her responsibilities at LaFonda, she's also, are you still the chair of the Tourism Commission? Yeah, she's a big deal. But she's also, I think of her as a mentor and a leader, and I'm really grateful to everything that she has done to help me personally in my career. And I know you all do not care about me. You want to hear from these women. But just know this is a powerhouse group, and if there is not a better group of women to talk about the importance of women in this history. So I think we're starting with Barbara. So I'm going to hand it over to Barbara. And here we go. You get this guy.
Hello, welcome. Thank you. It's always a pleasure to see you. It's always a pleasure to talk with you and share a little more information or lack of information. And I'm going to let Katrina really talk about the Route 66 piece. I am going to talk a little bit differently about Mary Elizabeth Jane Coulter today. So this is one of my favorite quotes that was printed right after LaFonda was reopened in 1929. I'm going to let you all read that yourself. As I was going back through and thinking about the different times that I've spoken about Coulter and I've spoken about LaFonda, I thought, my gosh, we're kind of redoing the same information. Right? It's the same photos because there's not that much really known about her. So here's this great romantic version of her in 1892 as she's teaching, at the Mechanics Art School in St. Paul. Here she is in 1893. Her friend painted this. Again, there's a whole group of people that, this is Mary Elizabeth Jane Coulter. Then here she is in the Park Service, right? So here she is in 1931 with the blueprints and the hat and the jewelry. And I really thought to myself, who is this woman? Who knows? She's an enigma. She is an enigma. She continues to be an enigma to me, and I would say I'm doing a good job of trying to walk in her footsteps. And so the idea of an enigma, right? Something hard to understand or explain, inscrutable. I looked this up in Merriam-Webster. I thought this was great. An enigma is not easily understood, especially because he or she has a confusing mixture of qualities that seem to be in opposition to one another, right? The attention-seeking but reclusive musician, the brilliant lawyer who gets lost on the drive home. Who is Mary Elizabeth Jane Coulter? So what do we know? I might be on the long side of the 15 minutes, so I'm going to blow through some of this if I can. She was born in 1869, Pittsburgh, right? I want you all to remember 1869 because Katrina's going to talk about Route 66. I'm going to talk about a little before Route 66. I'm probably doing the timeline, Meredith. She died in 1958 in Santa Fe. When she was 88, she moved around a lot as a child, right? And when she was 11, she landed in St. Paul with her family. Her father died when she was 17. She attended California Art School of Design. She apprenticed for an architect for a year. Nobody knows who that architect is. She taught at the Mechanic Arts High School in St. Paul again from 1892 to 1907. We know in 1902 she got hired by the Harvey Company to design the interior of the Indian room interiors at the Alvarado building in Albuquerque, right? And it was part-time, it was her first job with the Harvey Company. We know in 1905 she did the Grand Canyon, the Hopi House at the Grand Canyon. She did a number of buildings right at the Grand Canyon, of which she's probably the most famous for. Hermit's Rest, 1914, Lookout Studio, 1914, Desert Watchtower, probably her most iconic and famous, 1932, Bright Angel Lodge, 1935. The Bright Angel Lodge drawings may or may not be by Coulter. Those are the only ones that may or may not be by Coulter, right? She's an enigma. What do we know about her at La Fonda? We know she did work from 1926 to 1929. Local architect John Gaw-Meem and his partner Curtis McCormick, I just made that up, Meem and McCormick, don't quote me on the first name. Right, he is clearly the architect of record. The drawings are in his name. There are many notes between them. Okay, there's actually notes from her to him because they're saved in his files down at University of New Mexico. We don't really know what he wrote back to her, right, because she didn't save any files. Again, an enigma. We know she definitely had input into the guest rooms and the public spaces because, again, there's notes to Meem about what was going on. Keep in mind, Meem was young. It was his first commercial project. She had been working with the Harvey Company, right, since 1902. I love this. She called this the Grandee room. We know that her last project was in 1948, and it's La Cantinita, which is now the French pastry shop. And if you go to the French pastry shop, it still has this ode to this big old tumbled brick place. And again, she was known for kind of these historic stories and these romantic storylines. We know she never married, she never had children. We know she worked in a man's world. I still work in a man's world. We know business, right? The Harvey Company. We talk all the time about the Harvey girls. The Harvey girls, we love the Harvey girls. Service. They're the ones serving the food, bringing you your drinks. Who's driving the buses? Who's driving the trains? Who's making everything work on time? The boys, right? It's the men. So it's Byron and Fred Harvey. Just made that up. Ford Harvey, right? It's J. Frederick Huckle, who was married to Minnie Harvey Huckle. It's Herman Schweitzer, who's the head of the Native American Arts. It's David Benjamin, you know, an accountant who's talked about often in Stephen Fried's book. It's E.A. Harrison, who was one of the railroad superintendents, who probably signed off on most of her drawings, which happens in companies all the time, right? And then, of course, there's the There's the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, right? Again, it's men. And in particular, Ed Ripley, who was the president, and I'm going to talk a little bit about, was very instrumental in the 1863 World's Exposition. And you're all like, what? And William Haskell Simpson, who was really the brainchild behind this whole idea of advertising and posters. And so if you go out and you look at the Cassidy paintings that are through the lobby of La Fonda, right, that was the start of this whole marketing idea of how do we romanticize and bring people to the West. We know she's still in a man's world, architecture, right? So again, she was born in 1869, she didn't graduate. In 1870, out of 2,000 people who identified as architects, one was a female. In the 1890 census, and I kind of love how this is phrased, because drafters, architects, designers was all one category. And so less than 2% of those people were women. In fact, 22 women said, again, we're architects. To let you know how far we've come, in 2021, which is probably true in 2022, 17% of licensed architects are women, right? So it's still a man's world. If you've been on a construction site lately, generally it's still all men, which frankly I love. So what were influences of the time? The reality is arts and crafts, right? Oops, didn't go there. Arts and crafts. So this whole idea of arts and crafts, when she was in school in California, this would have been happening in school. This would have been taught while she was in school, and certainly when she lived in the Midwest. in Kansas City, right, and up and down the train line, she would have heard all about the arts and crafts movement. This idea about local native materials, right, return to craftsmanship, appreciation for regional cultural and landscape. And again, to put this in context of the time, this is a response to the Industrial Revolution, right? Everything's newer, brighter, better. Coulter is absolutely saying, let's take a step back. Let's look at this a little bit differently. Let's look at this idea of craftsmanship. At least I think she is. We don't have anything in her writing. Right? Let's talk about the West a little bit. So again, Coulter's born 1869. The Civil War ends in 1865. You know what all those officers do? They come west because there's this whole idea of the expansion of the West. This is a very quick history. Meredith would do it very differently. Right? But this idea of the expansion of the West, right? So you have all these people coming out, and maybe they're looking for some jobs. The Indian Wars start, right? I mean, they've been going on, but the reality is in Dakota, or in Minnesota, one of the most well-known, and I'm going to go with slightly egregious, right, is the 6-week war in Minnesota, which again, Coulter would have heard about. She lived in St. Paul. This is that idea, and it pains me to say this because today, right, we all are in a different place, but this is this idea of, right, the savage Indian, right, the other. Here we are. And now we're going to talk a little bit about I totally missed one. Okay, now we're going to talk about, precursor. Rail travel. So if you think about, right, rail travel really kind of started in the Civil War. I mean, it was going on beforehand, right? But the Civil War is when we started really moving out into all these different places. And in 1859, right, is the charter for the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, that famous railroad. That's pretty late, right? That's 10 years before Coulter is born. In 1869, you have the first transcontinental railway. Again, you think about the world and the United States is expanding. 1876, Fred Harvey starts his company, right? And this is about bringing on food, concession, right? Making the traveler's stay a little bit nicer. Of course, in mid-1894, which Stephen Fried has certainly talked about, right? The Atchison and Topeka and Santa Fe Railroad, along with the majority of railroads, right, in the United States, nearly go bankrupt and fail. So we have this very short-lived idea of the romantic idea of the trains, and suddenly it's like, and we're done. And again, if you think about this, both the Fred Harvey Company and the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad would be very interested in building their business back up. So other influences that would have been going on is the World Fair. And I want to show this picture because this is actually from the 1915 Panama, California exposition in San Diego. This is the New Mexico State exhibit. This is called Painted Desert, otherwise known as the Indian Village, and this is clearly based on Taos Pueblo. Am I just plowing through these? I think I lost pages. I was like, Okay, so this idea of world fairs and exposition, again, so we've talked about the United States is opening up, but the world is also opening up, right? 1914, the Panama Canal opens. Suddenly we have lots of goods, access to different stories, access to different people. The first World Fair is the 1893. I want to talk about that, right? Because the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe and the railroad people are at that fair. The 1904 St. Louis Exposition, which was really about the Louisiana Purchase, right? They're there as well. Coulter had students from her high school class who won awards in both of those fairs. So she would have known what was going on. Both of those expositions started showcasing people of the world in Native American villages in different ways that today we would find probably a little distasteful. 1905, we talked about the Hopi House was built. I swear I had photos, but I may not have. And then again, the 1915 Panama Pacific Railroad, or Panama Pacific Exposition. What's interesting about this is the Harvey Company was there with all of those men that I mentioned. The Atchison Topeka Railroad was there with all of those men that I mentioned. Coulter was there. Rapp and Hendrickson was there. Isaac Rapp was there. Isaac Rapp is the fellow who did the art history of New Mexico, which is kitty corner right across the plaza, as well as the initial piece of La Fonda where the lobby is. So again, you think about this whole idea of this romantic notion, the Santa Fe style, this storyline is already in play and moving. So her qualities. Clearly, in my world, she was an architect and designer. And she completed over 21 projects, both interior and exterior. And as I was kind of digging through this, and I realized there's not probably Shaw heads here, only Harvey heads, or Fred heads, I found when the Fred Harvey Company wrote something in their newsletter for when she passed away, and they absolutely called her their architect and designer. She was a storyteller, but it was this whole idea around staged authenticity. And the reality is, part of the reason we love La Fonda as much as we love it is because every room you go into tells a story, right? You look at the tin light fixtures and there's a story. You look at the fat walls and there's a story. You understand that there's this idea of this kind of Hispanic, Mexican heritage, right? There's this Native American heritage that comes through, and then there's this Anglo heritage. All of that is coming through. What's interesting about La Fonda, I think, is that Coulter was known for typically having very specific stories about each place that they went to. So if you've been to the Grand Canyon, you know the Lookout's Nest. It talks about a hermit who lives there and goes to do the lookout. Then you have Hermit's Rest, which is the one with the hermit, right? The idea of the Hopi Watchtower. You go to La Posada, again, there's a very clear story. There isn't really a story of La Fonda, which I think has been part of what makes it so charming, because you get to come in and tell your own story. No question she was a placemaker. So we talk about the West and we talk about the Southwest today as if it's always been here. The reality is, it was an invented idea that came out of the railroad, and it came out of this whole idea of how we're going to market this in order to bring people west with this expansion. So a lot of these things that just are today came in large part from people like Coulter. So, is she an enigma? I'm going to say yes, because there's lots of people digging around all the time and we're still looking at the same information, right? You've heard Stephen Fried say, gosh, if there's only files somewhere along the Kansas City rail line, right? None of us know, right? Thank goodness we have people like Burke who wrote the book, but it's still not a lot of information. I would say that Coulter is an enigma for me because, as I mentioned, I follow in her footsteps, right? I work with Native Americans, I work with Spanish artists, I work with Anglo artists, I work with white artists, right? I think architecture is a stage, right? It's a place where each one of us gets elevated by how we do things in a space. And there's no question that's what was happening with Coulter. I think she probably was a little sassy and salty, and I'm a little sassy and salty, and so I'm going to say she was probably a badass. And certainly, again, I'm not going to say it was obituary because that wasn't quite true, but what the Harvey Company wrote in the end was, many of the older members of our organization will remember her with admiration and affection, not only for her great creative imagination, phenomenal energy, youthful spirit, but also her colorful temperament and salty method of expression. So I'm going to leave it with this. And I think that speaks for itself. So with that said, I'm going to pass it over to Jenny. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm passing it over to Katrina, not Jenny.
Meredith is.
Hi, everyone.
Oh wait, Katrina, don't start yet. Sorry. Katrina has this awesome new podcast that we had as part of the presentation, and because of time and because of the medium of it being audio rather than visual, I opted to kind of pull that out, and I want to make sure that, Katrina, can you talk a little bit about the podcast? And then for people who are interested in the content of it, we'll give you the link so that you can listen to it and you can really kind of like get into it. But I wanted to give a heads up on that point before you got into your presentation. Okay, take it away.
Well, hello, everyone. It's a little disconcerting to be talking to myself. It's sad that I can't see you, but I'll do the best I can. But anyway, thank you all so much for being here, and it is an honor to be part of this amazing panel of women at one of my favorite places. I first kind of discovered La Fonda when I was living in New Mexico in my 20s, not in the 1920s, but when I was in my 20s. And it was kind of an oasis for me. And I would, I could come in. I certainly couldn't afford to stay at the hotel, but I could enjoy the French patisserie, not knowing that it was, designed by Meredith Coulter. And I could experience the amazing art in the hotel and really just soak up that atmosphere. It wasn't actually until I was making the Harvey Girls documentary that I could connect the hotel to this wider Fred Harvey history and to the Harvey Girls. And it was actually Dorothy Bowe. I'll just play a clip now from the Harvey Girls documentary who made that connection for me. And it surprised me when I interviewed her, because I had thought up until that point had really associated Harvey Girls with the railroad hotels. But obviously that was one aspect of the Harvey Girl experience, but there were other aspects to it as well. So if we can play the clip.
I was a Harvey girl for the La Fonda Hotel in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I started in 1941, and I left in the latter part of 1948. It's been so long since I've been to Santa Fe that it's really going to be a pleasure. I was born in 1921 in Kirksville, Missouri. My father contacted tuberculosis, and my sister knew how hard I was working, and she talked me into coming to Albuquerque, and so she bought me a ticket on the super cheap. I'd never ridden on a big train like that at all. It was so funny. That big train came in, and it made so much noise, and it was so long, I thought, my golly.
Starting in the 1930s, the Super Chief was the Santa Fe's flagship passenger train. Its celebrity clientele, luxurious interiors, and gourmet food gave it a glamorous vibe. But it was much faster than the trains before and made less frequent stops between Chicago and the budding city of Los Angeles, contributing to the close of some of the smaller Harvey houses.
When I first got to Albuquerque, when the train stopped and I looked out the window, it was wall-to-wall Indians. A few cowboys sprinkled around, but everybody was wearing Indian jewelry, Indian skirts. It was just surprising to see all that. And I was scared. I'd never seen an Indian before. The only Indians I had seen was on their Saturday afternoon matinees that you would go to for 10 cents. I later in years found out that I was part Cherokee.
After the 1890s, when the Santa Fe started opening big hotels, and then opened, El Tovar at the Grand Canyon, eventually this hotel we're in here today, La Fonda in Santa Fe, then people were being taken care of on their vacations for long periods of time by Fred Harvey.
This is wild. This is beautiful.
here. And this is Monty. This is Monty Chavis, my buddy. He died about less than a year ago.
Monty Chavis was what we would say a general manager. And he did everything. And he trained people.
This is Monty, that's me. What do you think of me? I'm cute.
Well, the first thing that really got to me was when they made you take 6 weeks of training to learn the French service, Russian service, English service, and be able to make a customer feel that they're very, very special. And that was his motto, was to feed the people right and give them the atmosphere that they needed. And that's what turned me on. I didn't feel like that I was just a waitress. I felt like more of an ambassador for Fred Harvey. You could see our skirts, how beautiful they were, and our blouses and everything. And that's what Fred Harvey wanted, everything to be perfect. This uniform was worn for luncheons in like the New Mexican Room, in the La Canita, and this was in the 40s. And this is a very heavy crepe, and then it's cut on the bias so that when you would walk, carrying a tray or just walking through the room or whatever, your skirt would swish. And it would give such a nice, graceful appearance in that kind of a skirt.
When the Harvey girls first came to this area, it was very much the frontier, and there was a great deal of effort to segregate the Harvey girls from all these rough characters. Harvey girls had dorm mothers. There were very strict rules as to how they could even interact with men. As time passed, those rules were relaxed a bit, and the Southwest became a little less rough around the edges.
We're about to go into a time warp.
Good morning. I'd like to tell you a story. We were girls that had dormitories. Well, this one day, this gentleman, Albino Ray, he gave us tickets. Well, we rushed to Monty, and there was 4 of us, and says, "Oh, Monty, can we go? We got the tickets and everything." He said, "Yes, but you got to be back here by 11 o'clock. Now, don't let me down." Well, we go to the concert. Oh, it was just marvelous. When we looked at our watches, we knew that we were 2 hours late. And we knew that we had to get back in, and we didn't know how. We walked around and we'd take turns trying to figure out and not let anybody see us that was from the hotel.
Can't get into the main door and you can't come through the lobby. You get fired if you're caught up there. And so we didn't know what to do. Well, outside our windows were these wooden poles about that far apart. Well, we knew we could all make it, but one of the girls was a very heavy-set girl, and she could not get back in. She got in and she'd shove this way and she shoved that way, and she was pushing this. She'd taken her coat, jackets, and everything off, and all of a sudden the light went on, and that was our Mother Superior. She said, "I thought you might like a little light on this subject, Dorothy, since it's in your room." I thought, oh, I'm going to get fired. Well, she didn't fire us. We had to clean the bathrooms for 3 months, and I mean, it was a dirty job, but we did it because we wanted the good job and everything.
So there's a slight delay on my end, but hopefully you can hear me. That was Dorothy, and as you heard and saw, she exhibited some of the qualities of many of the Harvey girls I interviewed, and that really made me fall in love with the subject and fall in love with them. She was poised, charming, great storyteller, very attentive to detail. You never wanted to go to a restaurant with Dorothy because she generally was not pleased with the service she received, no matter how many stars the restaurant had. But there were also some unique things about Dorothy that are not in the film that I wanted to share with you. After kind of at the end of her time at La Fonda, she worked at La Fonda in the 40s, late 40s. She married a scientist at Los Alamos. The marriage didn't go well, and she really had to escape it. And by this point, she wasn't working at La Fonda anymore. And so she moved to California. She went back to school. She got a degree in hospitality, and she started managing these big cafeterias. And she was really good at it. And a highlight of her career, she told me, was that she worked overseas in London, managing a big cafeteria for, I think it was Harrods. So she was very successful in business. And one thing that I think we, as women are often taught sort of subconsciously not to be competitive, but often successful women are competitive, and Dorothy certainly was. I remember taking her to a luncheon that I did for Harvey Girls at La Fonda, and she arrived at this event wearing a pin that said, I'm the original Harvey Girl. And she was surrounded by Harvey Girls who had worked at the Albuquerque airport. And they, of course, were not very pleased with her pin. And an argument ensued. And I was worried the lunch was going to completely fall apart, but it didn't. We made it through the lunch. And I just wanted to kind of highlight that element of her personality that you don't really see in the film, but one thing that I think made her successful in business was this kind of competitive drive and spirit. So as Meredith mentioned, I have a new project, Route 66 Women, the Untold Story of the Mother Road, which is being broadcast on public television stations right now. It's a 3-part series. And of course, if you want to find out more about it, you can go to route66women.com and find out where you can see the series. There are many Harvey Girls in both episodes 1 and 2. La Fonda, which is like amused me, also appears in episode 1 and episode 3. And the film series, as Meredith said, it really looks at how women overcame segregation and gender discrimination along Route 66. I think when we look at this icon, and kind of the symbol of the American dream and the American West, we often forget that travel is not the same experience for everyone, and particularly for travelers of color, they were not able to stay everywhere. They could face hostility and even danger. So I wanted to tell you just briefly about a very remarkable woman, Alberta Ellis in Springfield, Missouri, who established a hotel to serve Black travelers, because as a Black woman traveling on Route 66, she knew that she had to be very wary. And she started this hotel, and like La Fonda, it became kind of a community centerpiece, and it had a restaurant, it had a rumpus room where kids could go after school and be safe and hang out, in a hair salon, and she purchased a farm at one moment for travelers who couldn't afford to stay at her hotel. So that's kind of in episode 1 of the series, which looks at the early years of Route 66 through the eyes of women. Episode 3 is one of my favorites because we look at amazing women entrepreneurs like Jenny and creative spirits like Barbara, and how they are breathing new life into historic buildings. So we can go to my second clip now.
We are at the epicenter of where it all takes place. So this is really the convergence where the Santa Fe Trail, the Camino Real, Route 66, national trails, and they all really end at La Fonda.
Route 66 in the American West have been marketed to tourists as a place where adventure awaits. Now, institutions are looking for a deeper understanding of the West's indigenous cultures and landscape, which are still vibrant today.
We have art in this hotel since the early 20s up until today, and it's really interesting to see how the art has changed, how the artists have changed. So this mural depicts the Santa Fe Trail and was done by a woman artist in the 20s, Dorothy Stauffer, and it shows the West, the cactus, the covered wagons, the Spanish, the Catholic priests, the Vaqueros, cowboys, the Santa Fe Hills in the background, and it's a beautiful depiction that is at the entrance to the hotel that's painted in the 20s. You know, at that point, some of the entities that could afford artists were hotels. The hotels could afford to pay the artists to paint. Any of those women artists that were out here were contrarian. They were independent. They were, I mean, you wouldn't get on a train and move to the Southwest unless you had that streak, that creative independent streak. And I think this area has really benefited and thrived because of that. La Fonda is at the steps of the Native American Indian market that occurs every year in August. It's the largest Native American art market in the world. And so many of the award-winning artists stay with us. Marla Allison painted the fireplace behind us, who is an award-winning Native American artist from Laguna. And this fireplace depicts the embers of the fire going up the chimney, which is why she has the panels going up.
It's been really incredible to have a piece like Marla Allison's behind us, because it's not our interpretation of what we thought a Pueblo woman would do around a fireplace. It's Marla's interpretation and her sharing what happens at her own home. That's a very different voice.
This is another Marla Allison, and she won the ribbon at the Heard Museum.
The influence of being able to be an artist from this little place has been quite incredible.
So were you saying, Meredith, that the clip ended early?
Was I?
So it sounds like we've heard what we're going to hear from Marla, who is an amazing artist from Laguna, Pueblo. And in the film series, we take her all the way to, we follow her essentially to California, where she does a painting for us at the end of the Mother Road on Santa Monica Pier. When you interview, I guess, as many women as I have over the years, and you try to put their stories into this kind of wider context, there's obviously a lot of material that can't go into the films, and so those pieces kind of linger in your subconscious, and you hear. I feel like I hear these voices, and they've kind of become a fuel for my further creative adventures and processes, a jumping off place, I would say. So I just wanted to play one more short clip from Luz Delgadillo because she's been so seminal to my next project.
My name is Luz Maria Delgadillo Valadez Moore. All those names. And I was a Harvey girl at the Atchison Settlement during World War II. I'm not a Harvey girl from the East, I wasn't a Harvey girl from the Midwest and farms. I was a Harvey girl from the Southwest. When I got to Santa Fe, New Mexico, they ran out of white, tall blondes, the Harvey House type. And they met their first Indian and the first Hispanic girl. Well, they hired them. They came to Winslow, and I understand here in Winslow, there was a Harvey girl, Hispanic, and a railroad man came to the counter here at the La Posada Harvey House, and he refused to be served by the Hispanic woman. And the manager said, no, you go, she stays. Well, that kind of opened the door for me. December 7, 1941 was a famous day for World War, Pearl Harbor. And I was fresh out of high school, and I went to my father and I said, Papa, we have to do something this war. Have to do something, Papa. He said, no, my daughters don't have to work. And I begged and pleaded, and finally he gave in. He said, where you want to work? I said, I want to be a Harvey girl at the Havasu. So he finally gave us permission, and I went and applied for a job, and I got it.
World War II brought an unexpected boon to the Fred Harvey Company and the railroad, as the most reliable way to transport troops was by train. The smaller Harvey houses, many of which had been closed for more than a decade, were reopened, and the company went on a hiring blitz.
You're back.
So I think the 1940s is really a wonderful era, both for the Harvey girls, because you have this incredibly diverse workforce with Native American women, Latino women, even a Japanese American woman entering the labor force. And it's an exciting time in New Mexico too, because you have all of this, the troops coming through and this top secret science project. And La Fonda is kind of the epicenter, you could say, of all that. So I hope you'll listen to the podcast, the little sample we have available when you have a moment. And without further ado, I will pass it back over to Meredith.
Am I on? So this is the moment in like the Zoom lecture that you were watching during the pandemic where you would get up and you'd go to the bathroom and you would like press mute and pet your dog and take a break, right? So we're gonna like model that really quick before we get to Jenny, because I know we're probably a little antsy. So if you're able and you're willing and you want to, like stand up and just like shake it loose a little bit. If you don't want to stand up, that's fine. Just like wiggle your body. Like, I promise you, this is gonna help, I promise. Like wiggle. I'm very professional. Oh yeah, I have a 2-year-old. And now this is not like a 5-minute break, go to the restroom, it's just a wiggle your body, and I'm gonna give us I'm gonna count to 20, and then we're gonna sit back down and we're gonna continue. Okay, when I get to 20, come back. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Don't go to the bathroom, you have Jenny. You have Jenny, Kimball, do not leave. Look what I did. Okay, let's all sit down. Wasn't it nice to move our bodies? Oh, Jenny, I'm sorry. I saw it though, they needed to move. Okay, come sit back down. Because we know you want we want the questions. So okay, come sit back down. Come back. Come back. Yeah. Jenny's mad at me. See what you've done. But I promise you that moving our bodies, it's good. You'll have a more attentive audience, Jenny, I promise. I know, I'm sorry. Okay, she's gonna start. So remember, you gotta come sit down. Come on. Come on. These are the people you want, Jenny. Yours is 5?
Mine's a 5-minute deal.
Well, come on. All
I'm just laughing because I'm the one that hates these things and is so nervous, and that's so Meredith pulls that on me instead of y'all. But anyway, okay, can we cue up my slides, or do I need to do that? Okay. I don't have a thing to quiet people. So thank you guys. So I think my talk is very short, which is that's okay. Mine's very short, and mine is I think the toughest one because I'm going to talk about a friend. So if I lose it during this, please be aware. But so let me just ask you guys to hold your hands up. Who in the room knew Ethel Ballin? Okay. So all of you may have better stories, different stories than I do, and when we come to the Q&A, we'd love to hear about that. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about Ethel Ballin because This is Women's History Month, and when we started talking about influential women at La Fonda, we hear a lot about the Harvey girls. We hear a lot about the women on Route 66. We hear a lot about Mary Jane Elizabeth Coulter, but we really don't hear about Ethel Ballin. And when I stopped to think about it, Ethel ran the hotel for 40 years. So Ethel's influence on La Fonda is almost half of our centennial. And yet, maybe because she's the most recent, she's not as historic, but she is historic, and she was very influential at La Fonda. So I'm going to share some tidbits and some facts about Ethel. And I'm going to read some of it because I've got some quotes. So it's often the case that the story of La Fonda from 1968 through the 2000s is associated with Sam Ballin, her husband, the businessman. But Sam would not have been the man he was, nor would La Fonda admit her signature charm without Ethel's unique influence. Ethel installed a funky, colorful vibe throughout the hotel that resonates to this day. Let's see if I've got some. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about her. She grew up in a small Jewish community in the East Bronx in New York City. She was born in 1922. She graduated from Hunter College with a major in statistics, and she took courses in chi-square and analysis of variance at Columbia. I don't even know what chi-square is or analysis of variance, but imagine born in 1922 and a woman doing this. Just like Mary Jane Elizabeth Coulter, just like the Harvey girls. Wow, that's something that's hard for me in today's world to think about. So she did all that, and then she married Sam after he returned from combat duty after fighting in World War II, and before she started a family that ended up having 6 daughters. So before they embarked on their careers in hospitality, Ethel put her math mind to work. She headed up a national corporate office in New York which sold dress patterns. It's hard to imagine in today, but back in the day, that was a big booming business, dress patterns. And so this story I'm about to tell is a blurb I'm going to read from Sam's autobiography about Ethel and her work at the Pattern Factory in New York. She used her math mind to determine which patterns would sell best in which parts of the country and which were the best days to advertise. So she was so successful, she soon headed up the department with 3 statistical clerks working for her. The boss urged her to hire a professional assistant, and the finest of applicants turned out to be a math graduate girl who was black. Ethel hired her, and the next day Ethel was called into the boss's office. "What's this here I hear about your new assistant?" "She's the best of applicants," Ethel replied. "Well, I don't care about that. Fire her." "Then I go too." There was a long, long pause before the boss capitulated. He saved face by concluding the meeting with, "Well, just don't let it happen again." So on, from New York City to Dallas to Santa Fe at La Fonda, Ethel continued to live life on her terms. So just stop and think a minute in terms of our historic arc, what that meant. So this is Ethel and Sam with one of their daughters, Lenore. So this is after, when Ethel was, after New York, they moved to Dallas, and Sam and Ethel loved to travel. And I think they fell in love with the Southwest, and during the 50s and the 60s, when they would load up the girls in the car, come to the West, they camped in the Rockies, they camped in New Mexico, they went to the Navajo Nation a lot, they camped in tents. One of the stories that the girls told me, and Sam and Ethel told me on one of their trips, they left the girls at a Navajo woman's hogan for a week, and then they came back, and the Navajo woman did not speak English, and the daughters did not speak Navajo. So imagine as young girls being that kind of experience. But that's just who Sam and Ethel were. They figured, hey, it's a different experience. So in 1967, Sam and Ethel took a family vote and realized in 1967
their daughters were aged 5 to 16, and it was a Democratic family vote on whether they were going to move to Santa Fe from Dallas or stay in Dallas. I just can't imagine putting your life into the hands of a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old. But thank goodness for us, it was unanimous, and they moved to Santa Fe in '67. Little did they know they were going to embark on the journey of getting involved with La Fonda. So a year, and actually, when they moved to Santa Fe, they had five daughters. One died as an infant. They rented 2 hotel rooms, and Sam and Ethel were in one, and the 5 daughters in another, until they bought their house on Old Santa Fe Trail. Again, imagine putting your 5 girls from 5 to 16 in a hotel room in Santa Fe in 1967. Seems crazy now. So in 1968, Sam and Ethel and a group of their friends, actually Carol Gamble, would you raise your hand back there? Carol's aunt and uncle and parents were some of Sam and Ethel's first investors when they bought the hotel. And Carol is still an investor with us now today. So that's a beautiful thread from the Ballons to today is Carol. So thank you for being here. So when they bought the hotel, the rooms were being rented for $8 a night, and they went all in. They didn't have a lot of money to spend. The hotel was tired. They took over from the Harveys. The rail travel had petered out, and car travel became big, but the hotel had been run down. Because the Harvey Company was contracting, they hadn't put a lot of money in La Fonda, so it was looking tired and very worn. So one of the decisions in '67, before the Ballon bought the hotel, was the hotel going to be torn down? As you know, the Alvarado was. So can you imagine if Sam and Ethel and Carol's family hadn't bought the hotel? It could have been torn down, and we wouldn't have this remarkable history that we're all enjoying today. So while Sam and Ethel held court in La Plazuela, Ethel was working her magic behind the scenes. She often worked alongside our resident artist, and I put that in quotes because Ernesto Martinez was in our maintenance department. And over the years, he did become our resident artist. He had a studio down in our basement, and you gave him a paintbrush, and he painted. And a lot of that, I think, was because the ownership at that time didn't have a lot of money to put in the hotel. So what is an easy way to try to fix things up? Paint. So they painted and painted and painted. And it was Ethel who directed Ernesto on what to paint, where to paint, how to paint. So a lot of what you still see around the hotel, even though Ernesto was the artist, was imagined by Ethel. It was Ethel who directed Ernesto. These are in the ballroom, all the Membres characters along the walls of the ballroom. Ernesto painted all of that, but Ethel worked with him on how that was going to look, and they're still there today, beautiful. We've had them restored. So Ethel was the one that directed that. This is another painting of Ernesto's, so we still have that here. And another thing with this is another artist that Ethel found. These chandeliers were done by Ted and Jenny Arianes. They are still in our ballroom. The Arianeses also did the big chandeliers that are in the terrace. But I will read, there was an article in 1991, Santa Fe and about La Fonda, talking about these chandeliers. They described them as monstrous, the 10 chandeliers, because they were 6 feet tall, 5 feet wide, too large, according to the contractors, to ever be really made. In fact, they were so large they couldn't even be fit into our freight elevator without being taken apart. So Ethel commissioned them. And at the time, Ted and Jenny were employees at La Fonda. These are not 10 artists that they researched from around the world. These were employees, just like Ernesto Martinez here at the hotel. The Arianeses had done tin work, but they had not done any glass work. And Ethel just wouldn't take no. When they said, too big a project, can't do it, Ethel pushed and pushed and pushed. And you can see she was persuasive because the completion earned them great acclaim, and they ended up having a very successful tin and glass company. And so every time I go into the ballroom and look at those chandeliers, I think of Ethel and how many folks that she helped find their calling, including me. So probably the signature thing about Ethel is the word color. Oh my God. Ethel loved color. So I brought one of her coats that she had Ben Harjo, the Native American artist, paint for her. You can see it's a bit colorful. This is from the room we're sitting in right now. The chandeliers are still here. All the beams are still here with the beautiful bullets and carvings. Well, Ethel had each one of those painted in a different pastel color. And then you can see she had rain clouds made, and when Barbara and I worked on renovating the room, mainly because the lighting in here was so bad we couldn't have any functions, we tried to clean some of this up or make it simpler. And when we took down the rain clouds, they were made on, I don't know, a 16th inch plywood painted. I mean, they were just plasticky, cheap, cracked. But again, they didn't have a lot of money. You can put paint on anything, and if they're on the ceiling, you can't tell how, that you don't have to touch them or feel them. So we had a lot of things around the Fonda like that were very inexpensively done, but they drew your eye away because they didn't have the money to put into the hotel and really fix things, or what I call, for lasting. They were band-aiding and putting a lot of paint over things because they didn't have the money to put back into the hotel at that point. So to talk about color, every piece of furniture in La Fonda was painted by Ernesto and our team, our maintenance team. Every guest room had a different Mexican floral scene or landscape. There was not a headboard, table lamp, tabletop, dresser, picture frame that was not coated with bright, thick tempera paint. Actually, that side table's up in my office right now. That we've kept some of the original ones. This is one of the guest rooms. Talk about color. The blanket box was painted, the headboards were painted. You can actually see the panes in the window glass separating the bedroom from the sitting area was painted. Paint, 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 paint. Including La Plazuela. I think most of y'all will remember when all the windows were painted turquoise. You can see one of the reasons Barbara and I decided to take the color back to the original color, which was cream, which was, with all the folk art hand-painted windows, the turquoise sometimes would compete with the windows, and so by making it cream, it really made the folk art whimsy and color of the window panes stand out. And it's funny, when we did that, I guess not funny, I got a lot of hate mail from people saying, how can you take the historic turquoise out of La Plazuela? And once we could show them that historically that it was cream in there, that the turquoise wasn't the historic color, that usually made people a little less passionate or upset. But it's nice to run a hotel where you can change the color of something and then get hate mail, right? So then, do y'all remember? That's some color. And this was our old bar. And you can see pastel colors, paint again, above it, below it, on it, everywhere. And one of the, I'll get into that in a minute. So this is the wall that used to be between our bar and the lobby, and this was what most people called it Ethel's wall. Barbara and I always called it the Flintstone wall because it kind of looked like a Flintstone thing, but Ethel had it built because at that point the noise from the bar was floating into the restaurant and vice versa, and they wanted some kind of sound mitigation in between the two. So Ethel designed the wall, had our team make it, and the reason we took it out is when Barbara and I were working on the lobby renovation, we took the bar back to the original size in the lobby, and originally that wall was not there. So in trying to take the hotel back to the bones of the 20s, that is one of the things that we removed when we did that. But that was all Ethel, and it looks like Ethel. So this is an artist named Jonathan Kimball, who you will see, he's in a lot of our guest rooms, he's in a lot of our meeting rooms, he's in a lot of our halls. So Sam and Ethel had a very soft spot for the artists. You've seen these all over the hotel. Well, the reason you did is because, again, they couldn't pay artists to do work. So he lived in the hotel for free in exchange for art. And so that's why we have 60 pieces, 100 pieces of his. I don't remember how long he stayed in the hotel, but it was a long time. So, that was what a creative way to be a win-win for everyone. He was an itinerant artist. He didn't have a place to stay. They put him up and they traded for art. And we're still doing that to this day, I might add. So y'all might remember some of the corridors filled with posters. These were all posters throughout, from the opera, from the Santa Fe, the music performance. These posters to me represent Ethel's deep commitment to our community. Ethel donated to every nonprofit in town, SWIA, IAIA. I was involved with her on the Buckaroo Ball, the United Way, Opera, Food Depot, Santa Fe Playhouse. And in return, we were gifted hundreds, if not thousands, of signed posters. And so what do you do with hundreds of signed posters? You get your maintenance department to make the little rust frame, and you put it as art all along the wall. So again, a very creative way to draw your eye from some of the things that might not be as nice in the hotel, and a very inexpensive way to honor your community, to honor the nonprofits, and yet allow art in the hotel when you didn't have the profits that were able to buy art. The interesting thing for Barbara and I when we were trying to figure out what to save and what not to is the problem with this is they had these framed posters next to $250,000 original museum quality art, and it was all mixed together. There was no curation of an original museum painting next to framed posters. So that's one of the things Barbara and I have worked with to try to highlight some of our more expensive art. So another art influence was Ethel and Sam. I don't know if all of you know or not, but that gigantic bronze figure that towers over Museum Hill was paid for by Sam and Ethel. The artist couldn't afford the bronze because it's a humongous sculpture. He had designed it, and one of the museums came to the Ballons and said, we have this signature piece on Museum Hill. It's done, the artist has done it, and we can't afford to make it. And Sam and Ethel wrote the check. So this is the kind of people, Sam and Ethel were, that when somebody needed help and that they had the funds, they wrote the check. I include Tony's piece. Most of y'all know Tony Abeda. Sam and Ethel bought that at an auction from SWIA, and that sits up in our Bell Tower bar lobby. So if they couldn't buy directly from the artist, they usually went to the nonprofit auctions and spent the money to, again, try to help the nonprofit community by buying art for the hotel. So one thing that you might not quite be as familiar with Ethel is what influence she had on our food and beverage operations. So that's our signature blue margarita, which Ethel would never give the recipe out. I guess we clearly know it, huh, John? But anyway, the blue margarita was Ethel's recipe, and we are still serving them today. The picture on your right is what is Ethel's chicken salad. That was Ethel's recipe, and that's on our menu every summer, and anytime we try to take it off, we get hate mail again. And I do have the recipe for Ethel's chicken salad if anybody wants that. So it's amazing that today we still honor Ethel and her recipes. So one of the things I will just end with, there's some people who thrive on accolades and public recognition, and that was not Ethel. Ethel was an adopted mother to me and to our entire staff, and she was the quiet force behind much of LaFonda's success. This is the final story which resonates with me and many of our long-term employees who are still here, and one that demonstrates her values and her generous spirit. So Sam was going to give Ethel a very expensive piece of jewelry as an anniversary gift. But instead, she asked Sam, don't do that. Don't buy it. Take the money you were going to spend on that and give it to our employees. They're the ones that deserve this. That's exactly what they did. They took the funds. Every employee of LaFonda got a bonus, and that's exactly what happened. I don't know many women that might have made that choice. I hope I would have, but who knows? And to me, that pretty much summarizes Ethel's priorities. She put employees first always, and that's putting employees first is where you get the return, and Ethel always understood that. So this month, when I think about the women who have influenced LaFonda over the past 100 years, Ethel very, very much steered the ship from 1968 until her death in 2006, almost 40 years. She was instrumental in establishing the family culture we have here at LaFonda, and which makes this place so special. She continued the tradition of Mary Coulter's love of folk art, the whimsy, the color, and like the Harvey girls, she impacted service and food of the hotel. And she was a woman of Route 66. So in so many ways to me, she ties up this entire lecture series of talks. And I don't want her legacy to be lost to history. So I appreciate y'all letting me tell little stories about my friend Ethel. That's all.